I hope everybody had a good week and weekend. In light of events that happened last week, um, I think it's completely tragic whenever anybody, regardless of whether or not we agree with them, loses their life over expressing their opinion. And I want you to know that here at Utah Tech, University does everything possible to ensure your safety so you have a safe space to express yourself and explore the freedoms that you should be enjoying. Uh, so please feel safe here at this campus. I This week we are going to be talking about. Well, last week we talked about the Mughals in India, and here we're moving a little bit to the west. There is going to be some overlap. This takes place towards the tail end of the Crusades and moves forward quite a bit. So there is some overlap. There is some overlap with the Renaissance, and there's overlap with the Mughals that was going on as well. Excuse me. And what we are going to be exploring is Mehmet II and the Ottoman Empire. I am, I am really amazed and impressed with what was going on here. Constantine, when he became an emperor of Rome, started moving the Roman Empire seat east to the east. He His seats included Ravenna, which is in eastern Italy, and he ended up moving all the way over to Anatolia and founded the city of Constantinople. He built one of the largest buildings in the entire world at the time, the Hagia Sophia, or the church celebrating the holy wisdom of God. And his Roman Empire embraced the the different the differences, the different worldviews, the different languages, the different perspectives of the different people that he encountered. Well, the Western Roman Empire, it started producing emperors that stressed more and more about, or with people and senators that made decisions that represented perhaps a little bit more close-minded perspective of working with other people, uh, ridiculing people that were different, that had different sounding languages, and eventually, after another couple generations, that empire fell. But the Eastern Roman Empire that Constantine had started lasted for about another 1,000 years. And during that time, towards the end of that time, uh, as the emperor, those Roman Empire emperors started losing their power, the people that came in to take over this loss of control were a family of Muslims, and they were the Ottomans. And this image is a portrait of Mehmet II, who uh, he was the one that broke through and succeeded in taking over Constantinople. He very quickly began to establish controls in the area. And it's interesting because he inspired an awful lot of that same kind of cross cultural support and artistic exploration and scholarship that Constantine had celebrated 1,000 years earlier. And I think that went a long ways in, or I believe it went a long ways in really helping the Ottomans remain a strong force to be reckoned with for several more centuries. Here's something interesting that I'm pretty sure that none of you have ever heard before. Flowers mean specific things, and red rose usually signifies passion in a relationship. Pink or white roses mean something different. A yellow rose is something that represents friendship. And different flowers mean very different things. There are lilies for funerals. Um, there's different flowers for other celebrations or for commiserations. And there is actually a language of flowers that the Victorians used quite a bit that they borrowed from the French. But the French in the 18th century had established that language as the language of flowers because of all the information that they got from the Ottomans. They had taken the Ottoman courts' use of the language of flowers, brought it to France, made it their own thing, and then passed it on to the Victorians. So it goes back to the Ottoman courts. And one of the reasons is that the Ottomans were very Muslim and they worked with a lot of different cultures. There were Ottoman rulers who actually paid for Christians to go and study painting in Italy and Europe to come back and paint portraits of saints and of God and Jesus Christ in their own Christian churches. These are Muslim rulers that supported other religious people being active in their religious faiths. So they were pretty open minded, but in the court, it still was very important to maintain a certain amount of religious propriety. And so, with it being very important that a woman retains her sanctity as a woman, a lot of the court intrigue that women were involved in had to have its own kind of secret code. So it would be very difficult for anybody to uh, blackmail or abuse positions of power where women were involved. And that's where the language of flowers was developed so that um, women could talk to each other in complete secrecy by giving bouquets to each other, telling each other of their support and their loyalty, uh, and warning different other people of different people's intentions and things like that, just by communicating with the language of flowers. And that's where it comes from. But so if you ever wonder why different flowers mean, there's flowers for different birth months and things like that, that's where it has the roots in it. It goes all the way back to that, believe it or not. And I think it's really fascinating. If we look at Turkey, where it's situated, we have Africa. Let's see if I have a better map than that. I think that this one is not too bad. This is the north coast of Africa. You can see Egypt right here. We have this the Mediterranean Ocean. And this is the Sea of, I think, the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So, the Holy Lands are right through here. We have Cyprus, which half of it is Turkish and half of it is Greek. We have Greece right here in Italy. We have the Black Sea right here. My family actually comes from this area around here. We have India, where we had just finished studying. India is off the map to the right. This area right through here is Turkey, right in here. Now, why is Turkey important? We look at this little teeny tiny bridge of land right here. There's a little teeny river that goes right here connecting the Mediterranean through Greece to the Black Sea. And that little teeny, it is a huge river, because, we are looking at like way up in space looking down at this. It's called the Bosphorus. But this is where the East connects to the West, right in this little teeny area right here. And if you get trade ships up through here into this ocean, you can bring them all the way over to here, and it really helps in putting them onto trade routes so you can trade with India and ultimately China. And also so that China and India can trade with Africa and Europe. So it becomes strategically very important. When the Crusaders were coming down into the Holy Lands and North Africa, they would travel through here. Sometimes they would get on boats, come up here, go to right to this area as well, get resupplied and organized, and then march across the safe, controlled lands of Turkey till they got down to here, and then do their thing, fighting for the Arabians for the Holy Land. And even though that's just two instances, Turkey has had that kind of position for millennia, where it is the natural trade connector because it is very habitable. Lots of people live there. It's very fertile soil. It's a really healthy physical land. And there are deserts and other things too, but it is a really healthy and beautiful land. Um, Paul the Apostle is famous for living in or going on missions in Turkey. And this area right around here is where St. Nicholas was born, who we know as Santa Claus. And today you can book a tour in Turkey where you go to this village that looks like it's typical Bavarian style Christmas village, German style buildings and stuff like that, where you can buy Christmas ornaments and all sorts of stuff by vendors and artists who are Muslim who celebrate the fact that St. Nicholas was born right through here. You can go on other tours where you visit the cities like Tyre that Paul the Apostle went to on his missions. So lots of really amazing stuff. And this little lake right here is called Lake Van. And this has nothing to do with the lesson whatsoever, other than the fact that, well, actually, it doesn't have anything to do with the lesson, but Lake Van has their own version of the Loch Ness Monster. And so if you ever get a chance to go to Turkey and go to Lake Van, you can get, I've seen the Loch Ness Monster, or actually, it's the Lake Van Monster there. You can get a t-shirt like that. And there is currently $10,000 reward for any hard evidence that demonstrates that the monster is actually real. So, just in case you guys want to earn that. The period of time that we're talking about is at the tail end of the Crusades. Mehmet II was consolidating lands that he felt were appropriate to be an extension of Muslim-controlled environments. And at that time, he took over Constantinople. And if we can blow in, Constantinople is right there on the Bosporus. And it's a city that is considered to be on both sides of the river. So Turkey is this little bit right around here, all the way to over here. And another word for Turkey is Anatolia. The reason why it's called Turkey now is because of Ataturk, right around World War I or so, was trying very hard to make sure that Turkey was not did not get ruled by insane leaders. He was trying very hard to make sure that it didn't become a victim of colonization, like India and so many other areas around, like in Africa, had also become colonized. And since his name was Ataturk, the country was named after him now, and it's called Turkey. So that's a little bit of the background. And I'm trying really hard to remember to make sure that I click on all the pages so you guys can kind of see what I'm seeing. The Ottoman, as is true with many of the countries and empires that were ruled by people who identified as Muslim, there's a lot of misunderstandings in the West by this that are kind of driven by just expectation rather than what is really going on. And so as you learn about different cultures that are ruled by different worldviews, be really careful. Just like we talked about in India and things like that, be really careful and make sure that you don't judge that culture by the standards that you have for your own culture, as well as by the expectations presented to you by other media outlets. It's always good to do a little bit more research and keep your opinions kind of fluid until you have more information. But what is really interesting to me from about the 8th century on is that a lot of the Muslim leaders had access to and read heavily the Greek classics, the same classics that informed Western science. They had access to. So they read Plato, they read Socrates and Aristotle. They loved that kind of stuff. They were very invested in math and science and exploration of education, men and women both. A lot of women and a lot of men were equally well educated. In fact, many of the modern societies, the first women to hold executive positions were in Muslim cultures, starting in the 19th century. So, just a little bit of information there. But some of the things that we can see if we look at this is, and this is indicative of a lot of Muslim culture, but specifically Turkish artwork as well. There's a lot of stuff going on visually, and hopefully this reminds you a bit of the Taj Mahal. And hopefully this band of white inset into blue kind of reminds you of some of the stuff we saw around the Taj Mahal. These are inscriptions from the Quran, the Holy Quran, in Arabic. And it's done with white clay or white tile, collaged in or mosaicked in with blue tile. And you'll see that in a lot of public space Muslim buildings in many different places around the world. We also see a lot of floral decoration. We have this kind of abstract floral things. We have pillar forms. And these are not designed to be naturalistic looking vignettes. That's not what they're supposed to be. But this kind of idea harkens back to some of the things that Plato talked about. He introduced the idea of the world of the real, or the ideal realm. Christian scholars later adapted that to the ideal realm is the realm of God's abode, and Muslim scholars like that idea as well. So that the world of the real, or the world of the ideal, was a representation of that area of the universe around God's throne. So both coming to very similar ideas about that. And this is, I don't know if I watched with you guys the allegory of the cave, where Plato talks about somebody, imagine a group of people chained up their whole lives looking at inside of a cave, where all they see is a cave wall ahead of them. And on that wall, behind them is a fire. And in between the fire and them, there are people that parade by with noisemakers and different things, and then figures that cast shadows onto the wall ahead of them. And they can't move their heads. All they can see are the shadows of the figures behind them. And they're told this shadow represents a horse, this shadow represents a person, this shadow is a wheel. These kinds. So all they have, their whole identity, or their whole interaction with the world, is being told what these shadows represent. And in the allegory of the cave, Plato says, what if one of these people is forcibly freed and then kicked out of the cave? So suddenly they came outside. And at first they're blinded with the real light. And they look around and they start recognizing the things that cast the shadows on the cave wall. So instead of seeing the shadow of a tree, they see an actual tree. And as their eyes adjust to the light, they even notice that in still water, you can see a reflection of them. So you can see what they look like instead, not just their shadow. They see just an expanse of reality with all these bright colors. And just, it's amazing to them. So they, in their excitement, they run back to the cave and tell the people that they have been chained up next to, hey, this isn't real. I just been outside. I know what reality looks like. I know what the real world is. And the people in the cave say, you're crazy. You're insane. And they beat them. That's the allegory of the cave. And what Plato was saying is that it's our responsibility to do the best we can to find those layers behind what we experience and claim as real. And that world that exists behind the things that we identify as real in our own present reality is as different from what we experience as real as that actual outside world is to the people who have been chained up in a cave. So our present real experience is just like the shadows cast on the wall. And this led to something called the world of the ideal, or the world of the real, or the world of true forms, where this is an idea that Plato said we share a concept of a chair. And behind that concept of the chair, even though there's an infinite variety of how chairs can be expressed and made and built and used, somehow there is something behind all those that represents the ideal chair. It's completely immaterial. We can only access it through our imagination. And that's why every human being on the planet, when you tell them to make a chair, will make a different thing. They'll all function as chairs, but they'll all be slightly different. But that world of the ideal was something that medieval Christian artists and Muslim artists really enjoyed working with. And the way that they expressed that was by things like this, where they would take plant forms that looked like botanical specimens, that they were perfectly flattened, they were perfectly laid out, or they were idealized somehow, or they were abstracted somehow. And this vegetation, that it does not look realistic, is not intended to be realistic. What it is intended is to express that this has a greater connection to that world of that realm that exists around God's throne, for example, the realm that approaches heaven. It represents timelessness. It represents those ideas of continued growth, continued blessing. So that's why we see that there. And then you also see this even more abstracted vegetal matter or vegetal shapes around here. You'll blow that up a little bit. You can see that there are flowers, and there are specific flowers. They each mean something different. Like right here, through here, we can see acanthus leaves, and acanthus is a plant that in desert environments in North Africa, the Middle East, and that whole region, it grows anywhere from 3 to 5 feet above a water source. So if you're walking through the desert, desperate for water, you see an acanthus plant, and that is something kind of reminiscent of a yucca, but the leaves, instead of being straight and smooth on the edges, are really kind of jagged. They have a lot of texture on the edge. Whenever you see something like that, you know that your life has been saved because you just have to dig down 3 to 5 feet and you find a source of water. And so the acanthus becomes a symbol used in a lot of Islamic art as well as European art after the Crusades. The acanthus becomes a symbol of the benevolence of God, that God is watching out for you. That's why he made you see that he planted that plant there so you could see that there's water there and it could save you in a desert environment. So there are different plants like that that show up. Lilies, different. The lotus is one that's really common. The Turkish style lotus is very distinctive, and the lotus represents the promise of something beautiful growing from stagnant pond water, and it's a symbol for the potential of humankind, and that we all have the possibility of growing into something beautiful through things like divine messages and trying to live commandments and doing different things like that. Something else you probably don't know is that uh, Muslims um, is Islam is a religion that is rooted in the Bible as well, and so they're very conscious of the Ten Commandments and things, just like Christians and other Westerners are. And so there are a lot of different things going on here, but a lot of these designs are intended to bring comfort and ease to the person coming into the room, or for things like this to help you think of those kind of lose connection with your temporal problems and kind of lose yourself in the beauty of this ceiling as your mind starts going into higher or exploring higher realms of thought. That's what these kinds of things mean. And there is symbolism for colors as well. Um, a lot of the times, colors like turquoise, blue, and green represent the ease of life that happens, that is prevalent in the kingdom of heaven, for example. It's indicative and representative of coolness and having plenty to drink, having plenty to eat, comfort and ease and health. So that's one of the things that you'll see very common. And we're going to look at something that I think is really interesting. We look at something like this. This is the Soleimani Mosque made by Mimar Sinan. And this is something that I think that we can usually recognize as being Islamic architecture. That's something that, this is the part of the vision that we have of Islamic architecture. And you can see resonance with the domes and minarets and stuff like that. What's really fascinating to me is if we go back in time, I'm going to pause this to this church here. And I'm going to share this new tab. This is the Hagia Sophia. Now, these 4 towers were added later. But this building, the rest of this building, was constructed by Constantine, the Emperor of Rome, who labeled himself a Christian. He felt he very much was a Christian. This is a gigantic structure. And you can see the domes right here, these beautiful, expansive domes. And one of the reasons this is so gigantic, I think if you and I were to stand on it, we would be about the height of these little black dots you see as windows right here. This is a gigantic building. This is huge. And this central dome, there's nothing underneath it. It is unsupported on the interior. But all that weight carries out to these walls, and all the weight from that carries out to these further walls. And these domes are designed to distribute the weight, which is one of the reasons why Constantine was able to build essentially the largest hollow building that survives in the history of the world to that point so far. Now, this looks very Muslim, but it's not. One of the reasons why we identify it as Muslim is as Muslim architects were going through the area, they were so taken by this beautifully gigantic Christian church full of righteous majesty that it inspired Muslim architecture. And I get that from my friend, Dr. Ahmed Safi, who is the director of Islamic Studies at Duke University. Some of the things that are interesting about this is on the inside, there are many mosaics that Constantine and his relatives and his descendants had commissioned that show different religious scenes. And typically in Islam, it's not appropriate to have and listen to me very carefully about this because this is a specific instance. It's not in all Islamic artwork, but when you're talking about the interior of the worship space where people are actually going to be praying, it is not appropriate to have depictions of human beings, particularly depictions that are labeled as symbolic of religious figures. And what is really fascinating is that this is one of the few Muslim sites in the world that is still being used as a mosque, where the inside actually does have a mosaic that survives of Jesus, his mother Mary, and his father Joseph. I just think that that's absolutely fascinating. When Mehmet II had finally broken through the walls of Constantinople, and his siege against Constantinople finally succeeded, and he marched in. His soldiers, like every soldier at the time, part of the way they got paid was by looting the cities that they conquered. They started going through all the government buildings and stuff like that. And when they got to this, Mehmet was coming up on his horse, and people were going in, and they were starting to loot the inside of this Christian church. And the moment he came in, he saw and called for his troops to stop, and he said, "You will not desecrate this building. It is a house of God." So these Muslims who had just defeated a Christian force showed nothing but respect. And under Mehmet II, he had his men and his followers show nothing but respect for the Hagia Sophia, or the House of Divine Wisdom, is what this church is called. So it's just absolutely incredible building. Let's see if we can find a couple shots of the inside. This is a diagram of what it looks like. So this whole area is hollow, just absolutely gigantic. And you can see these these walls, there's 4 pillars that support the base of the dome, and um, it helps to distribute the weight of this dome out. And if you notice right around here, there are windows at the base of the dome, so all the weight is supported on these ridges along the dome. And these windows, they are pretty big windows, and these pillars are pretty big too. But when the light is shining outside, and you come into this building, your eyes as they're adjusting to the kind of subdued lighting inside, you look up at this dome, and the light comes through this clear story of windows. A clear story is a row of windows that is not used as an access point to the building. So this is at the base of the dome, these all these windows, that's called the clear story of windows, and it's spelled Clerestory. But when you come in and your eyes are adjusting, you look up and you see the dome from about this up, and you just see a ring of light. It's like it's resting on a ring of light that it's just barely attached to the building. It almost feels like it's floating. Absolutely astounding. And you can see that there's the pillars here holding it. Then you have another arch that carries the weight out, another set of piers that support the weight. So the outside walls are really heavy, they're really strong, but they're designed that way because Constantine's architects wanted to build this huge hollow dome. So this whole space, several stories high, is completely hollow. And I want to see if we can find. So here's an image of the inside of that hollow space that is just gigantic. And this is looking up at that dome. And so some is just the beautiful stonework that's in it. So definitely spend some time looking at that and exploring it, that video. Mimar Sinan was one of the architects of the Ottoman Empire. He's the guy that really put his stamp on the building styles because everybody after him did the best they could to copy him. He is very much like Frank Gehry. Is another one of my very favorite architects. Frank Gehry is still alive. Mimar Sinan hasn't been alive for several hundred years, sadly. But Mimar Sinan got started when he was in his 50s. He had a military career. He finally retired and got bored and taught himself how to be. He was an army engineer, and he taught himself how to become an architect, and he became an architect. And I believe over the rest of his life, is responsible for designing and getting built a huge, I think it was like 130 buildings, something like that. Hugely successful architect. But some of his stuff, all right, let's see, I want to show this to you. And you see that he was so enamored of the Hagia Sophia that a lot of his buildings, his mosques and stuff like that, followed that kind of model. And I hope you can see in this, you see that the pointed arch. We talked about that before, but you also see some of the holdovers and echoes from Constantine's Roman architecture. See, there's a Roman arch there. You see some more of these 4-point arches here, or that Wadi style peaked arch that we talked about. You see these very obvious domes that are based on a circle. That's also an echo of Roman architecture. And he built, I'm sorry, here we go. So hopefully you can see that. You can see the Roman style arch here, these domes that are based on the actual circle. Then you get these peak arches or pointed arches that like the 4-point arches that are indicative or remind us a little bit of that Mughal architecture. This is, I think this is where I believe it's reminiscent of that Wadi style natural air conditioning arch. We have the call to prayer minarets as well. And I want to show you with you another one. And some of these, it's hard to see really good photos of them just because they're so heavily built around them. This is the Salamania Mosque, and you can see the same kind of thing. It's different, but we have the arch, we have these, or the dome, It's based on a circle. It's not like an onion dome like the Mughals. This is based on a circle, a sphere. We have the Roman style arches up here that are round. We have the peak arch that is indicative of that Islamic architecture influence. We have a large central dome, just like the Constantine's Hagia Sophia, and we have the weight being carried as the domes kind of get smaller, the walls get smaller as they go out. And I'm looking for another one to show you. And I think this is going to be another thing where it's hard to see. The whole thing, just because it is so built up around it in the today's city. This is the Rustam Pasha Mosque. And again, you can see it's different from the other two mosques that we saw that Mimar Sinan did, but it still has a lot of those same features. We have this large central dome. We have smaller domes as they gradually move the weight out to the outside. We can see those echoes of Roman geometry with the fact that all these domes are based on, or most of these domes are based on the circle or the sphere, as opposed to that onion type of thing we saw with the Mughal architecture. We have that peak arch right here. This one, this is really fascinating to me, and this is a style of roof that I for pergolas that I think are really fascinating. We see some of this showing up in Italy as well as other parts of Europe. I think that's really fascinating. And if you look at these columns, they don't have that fluting on them like we saw with the Greeks. Or I don't know if you remember that from when you took 2710. They seem to be solid, and this is more indicative of kind of or consistent with Romanesque and Gothic style columns over in Europe. So I think that that's really fascinating. And this, there's a link to an article that I have towards the bottom, and I'll show you that really where it is really quick. If you go to this part of the module, Art of the Ottomans Architecture, and you go down here, right above the beautiful image of the Soleimani Mosque is this Istanbul Qs. And if you click on that, you come to this article. And it goes through, it has some really beautiful shots of some of these mosques and buildings that Mimar Sinan built. And this kind of architecture is incredibly powerful. I think it's absolutely astounding how beautiful some of this stuff is. And they are bringing these architects are modeling Mimar Sinan, but also who inspired Mimar Sinan. They're bringing in some stuff. Maybe you recognize uh, maybe some inspiration or some echoes from like the Dome of the Rock that was built 800 years earlier. But you could definitely see a lot of inspiration from the Hagia Sophia or the Church of Holy Wisdom. It was built under the reign of Constantine. Here's the inside of the Soleimani Mosque. Again, you have this beautiful, expansive, open ceiling space that is just incredible. And some of these, like, I don't know, it just is amazing to me that people without any of the technical tools that we have today, any of the construction equipment that we have today, were able to figure this stuff out and get it to work and then last for so long. It's just amazing to me. And you can see banners of the Islamic writing. And these, like, whenever you see this in a traditional or historical Muslim building, it's not going to be random words or platitudes. They are going to be verses directly from the Quran. Now, this one, look at this. Yes, this is Turkish architecture, and we can kind of see a little of that. We have the same kind of harkening to the central dome. We have stuff that seems to cascade out a little bit. We can see the Roman arches. This is a much smaller and simpler building. We can also see the peaked arches here. So we can see a little bit of that. Smooth columns, different things like that. And I think some of these looking inside are just astounding. Look at all the blue. It's really beautiful. You walk in here and it just feels like it's going to be a cooler space, or it looks like it should be a cooler space. I believe this is called a minbar. This is where the person who's leading the congregation will sit to deliver a sermon. You see the beautiful stained glass. It is beautiful stained glass. It's generally going to be based on the designs are going to be generally based on plant forms, geometry, and in the stained glass they will also write Arabic again, portions of the Quran. Just a lot of this stuff is just really amazing to me. So a lot of energy is put into creating these environments that are designed to welcome entire communities of people united by their desire to pray together as a community. Another element of the art of the Ottomans are ceramics. Again, we have a lot of blue, different things like that, but these ceramics are going to be uh, decorations both for religious buildings and secular buildings and homes, which I suppose are kind of secular buildings as well. And there are going to be a lot of flowers that you see over and over again. This right here, I have been told, is a stylization, is the visual stylization for a lotus for in Islamic art. And there are other flowers that mean different things, but you can tell this is stylized acanthus leaf again. And there, like I said, there are other flowers. One of the things that is really specific to Turkey, though, is a stylized tulip. I don't, I don't think I have one showing here, but as soon as we see one, you'll probably recognize it. Remember, we talked about floral symbolism and patterning, the language of flowers and different things like that. Flowers do mean specific things. Let's see if I can. Okay, here's this. The site you just saw me click on leads to right here, and this shows some of those ceramics. Let's see if I can find images of tulips. Okay, this really surprises me because tulips are really, really big. We can see a lot of these little red flowers, usually 4 or 5 petals. We see these blue buds, different things like that. But a lot of this is going to be hand painted. Iznik was a very influential area. They quickly built themselves up as the ultimate spot for ceramics. They made tiles for everything from covering the outside of mosques to uh, plates and dishes and pitchers for common use at families' tables. You know, and every possible connection for ceramic or possible permutation of ceramics in between. But let me show you a picture of tulips in Turkish art. And this is something that a lot of, okay, here's some really good ones. Lots of examples of the different kinds of stylizations of tulips. But the tulip became a plant representing things like blessings for the family, good fortune, health, positive vibes generally. And you can see there are a lot of different really interesting permutations of the tulip. And sometimes they get so far out of whack, it's hard to find the tulip in there. But these are stylized depictions of the Turkish style tulip that became very popular at this time. And you'll see, like on this one, very specifically calls out Iznik, which is the ceramics capital of Turkey. So So you can see this kind of another style of tulip. And then this kind of thing, these, you kind of recognize the influence of the lotus right here. And then when we have these kind of floral elements out here, this becomes a stylized carnation, which is a very Turkish flower as well. And kind of connecting and combining these together, abstracting things, different stuff like that, is what these artists did. And it comes from a very specific uh, design that is readily identifiable as Turkish, which I think is really fascinating. And definitely go to as many of these as you possibly can. Isnik tiles, where they'll have, this is an example of what Isnik tiles look like, where they'll have pictures painted on these ceramic tiles, fired and baked in, and then they would ship them out um, as stacks of tiles, and then artists would put them together so that it would make these great big pictures like this. Just absolutely beautiful work. So definitely check those out. The next one we're going to be looking at is textiles. And I hope you can see some of the same kind of attitude. Now, we think of Oriental rugs, and there are Oriental rug dealerships. There's one here in St. Joe, though there's several in Utah, St. George, Salt Lake City, different places like that, where they actually bring rugs from India and the Middle East and China. But what is interesting is that each region has some of their own stylistic choices that they show. This is an image from a very Ottoman style Turkish rug, and hopefully you can see the same kind of plants, is that kind of stylistic fusion of a lotus incarnation. There's other elements that kind of remind me a little bit of some of those things like we saw with the stylized tulips. You have this, which is kind of like that stylized acanthus leaf. And I'm going to click on this link and share with you. This is from the Met Museum. This is a carpet. These are images of carpets from the Ottoman Empire, from 1500s to 1600s. So right at the tail end of the Crusades. Some of these are so old that they will not allow flash photography because that can actually measurably destroy them. If you have bright lights around them and things like that. And it just, as old, ancient as these are, you can still see the incredible level of detail. What makes these carpets special? They would have a supporting grid, or not necessarily, it wasn't a grid, I'm sorry. They would have a supporting, uh, what's it called? Weft, maybe? I can't remember, but you'd have one line or a line of heavier thread going one direction and then going the opposite direction. That's where you would tie in the colors. And these are hand knotted, hand tied carpets that would then be shaved down so that they would have a pretty level surface to them. And these designs, you can see some of the stylized plant forms, like based on lilies, different things like that. We can have the little bit more recognizable flowers, where it's based on that kind of lotus and carnation combination. We have or something that's more akin to that lotus kind of look, something that feels more like an acanthus leaf. And a lot of these are abstracted, a lot of these are stylized. And it's just fantastic seeing what the different designs are. And the colors, the shapes, the symbols, uh, there is, the particular flowers, there is symbolism throughout. And one of the reasons why you recognize some of these, and they do feel very European, some of them, is because people brought these to Europe as a sign of wealth, but also as a practical necessity. Some of the carpets that were picked up that the Mughals had made, or that the Ottomans had made were brought to medieval Europe, and people traveling would use these as sleeping bags. They would lay the carpet down on the ground, lay down on it, and pull the carpet over them. Well-made carpet will function very well as an insulator. Some of these are actually stapled on walls at different points. Now, before the Ottomans really took off with these, earlier examples of these, like from uh, Persia and from India and from China even, would make their way to the West, and people would use them, uh, this kind of technology, to insulate their walls. And it became a symbol of wealth. If you remember, let's see, I'm going to see if I can pull up a picture of the Last Supper. Okay, yeah, here's a really good image. We'll pull this up. I'm going to show this to you. So being able to be wealthy enough to buy a carpet, have it, and because it traveled such long distances and was so, there's a lot of intense energy going into its making, and being able to use that as an insulation was a signifier of wealth. And in Da Vinci's portrait of the Last depiction of the Last Supper, you can see that there's 8 of these carpets. And if you look closely, you can see that are echoes of some of these Persian style designs, some of these Islamic floral designs that inspired the later Turkish stuff. And it's interesting to me that something like this, if you remember when that first Renaissance painting we looked at, where we were talking about learning the language, visual language of the Renaissance, this helps to place this whole thing in the Middle East, or the lands to the east, because at that time when Da Vinci painted this, the Ottoman Empire had just started producing things like this. And so a lot of these are probably coming from Iran and India, or the early Mughals. And it's still exciting enough with these kind of designs and stuff like that. It still reminds people of foreign lands, just like the little figures wearing turbans in the far distance around Mary and baby Jesus in that first painting, signify that it took place in the Middle East. This kind of thing signifies that this takes place to the east. It's outside of Europe, in mystical lands. So I think that's really fascinating that he chose these kinds of same kind of Muslim-inspired design carpets to put on the walls of this upstairs room where the Last Supper was held. Communicates some interesting ideas. And then we also, one of the big things for the Ottomans was calligraphy. And I don't know if you know this, but there were a lot of cultures that really value the martial arts, the like swordplay and wrestling and things like that, that really considered uh, a highly trained martial person, somebody who's successful in warfare, somebody who's successful in fighting, that they um, were expected to also learn things like calligraphy. In Japan, they also learned flower arranging. That was considered a very manly art. And in Turkey, calligraphy was considered a very manly art. There were women calligraphers too, but emperors and sultans and different people like that uh, learned calligraphy, and they did. In the Ottomans did some really fascinating stuff where they would even take leaves and then punch out areas between veins and use that to provide a background for the calligraphy. Now, in calligraphy in the West and calligraphy in Christian type cultures is a little bit different than calligraphy in Muslim cultures. In Christianity, The Word of God was made flesh and dwelt among us. That's what it says in John 1:14. And the Word of God was then connected to the symbolism of the body of Christ. And in the West, the cultures that are kind of driven by that Christian ethos and that Christian world perspective have a certain perspective on the human body. These are the cultures that made it very difficult for medical science to explore in the human body because the body was supposed to be uh, special and sacred, inviolate. The hierarchy of arts, the things that are the most important seem to be portraiture and depicting a human form. These are also cultures that have a very strong body consciousness, where the body is implicitly respected. And I think a lot of that ties this to that verse in the Bible. Now, in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad was trying to find a way to connect um, Judaism with Christianity. He was trying to find a way to bring those two views, which both grew out of the same book, the Bible, to bring them together, to find ways of people to connect. And in that process of finding what God wanted him to do, the prophet started a life of meditation and prayer. And when he was in his early 40s, he started receiving visitations from the angel Gabriel. This is the same Gabriel that came to the Mother Mary and told her she was going to bear the Christ child. He was the angel of the Annunciation. He came to the Prophet Muhammad and said, "People have lost their way. Uh, we need to bring them back to or you need to bring them back to the fold of God. So you'll recite the things that I tell you, because I'm reciting what God wants you to tell people." And that became the Quran. The Prophet Muhammad never learned to read or write. Gabriel would have him memorize the different portions that he would recite. And then the Prophet would go home to his wife Khadijah, incredibly well educated, successful businesswoman in a land where if you weren't married by the time you were 14 as a girl, there was no point to having you continue living for the family. And she was self educated, she was successful. And so he came to his wife and recited to her, and she would write down what the angel Gabriel had told the Prophet Muhammad. So in Islam, in Christianity, the Word of God was made flesh. That's what John says. But in Islam, the Word of God was made legible. It became the written form. So a lot of the reverence that Christians show the human form as a symbol of Christ, or the crucifix, things like that had Jesus's body represented. Muslims showed that's very similar, a parallel level of respect to the written word of the Quran. And this is one of the reasons why um, in the West, figure painting became really one of the most important forms of art. That's what we think of a lot during the Renaissance, figure painting and figure sculpture. And in Islam, and in areas that were heavily influenced with Islam, calligraphy became very, very important. Bookbinding, the book arts, books are respected. They will never, it doesn't matter what the book is, it should never touch the ground. All books are to be treated with reverence because, on some level, all books become a symbol for the Quran as well. And so there's a lot of reverence given that. But calligraphy and the book arts become incredibly important. And so this is a verse from the Quran, and by one of the Ottoman rulers whose name was Suleiman, and he was a very manly man, and he loved calligraphy. He was very well known for calligraphy. He was a calligraphy master. So watch some of these videos. It's very interesting stuff. Tugra is a style of calligraphy that is basically calligraphing a person's signature, and it becomes a, a seal. Let's see if we can find. And sometimes it's a way of layering the different components for a phrase or a name on top of each other, so it develops into kind of a graphic image by itself. And I'll show you what this looks like. So this is Tura, where it's not somebody writing in a line like you saw in those a lot of that the mosaics and those the first images that I showed you of Turkish architecture. This is things layered on top of each other. One of my friends is an accomplished calligrapher in Jordan who does portraits of people from scripture, important people from history, people like uh, Rumi, for example, different things like that, where he will write some of their favorite verses and phrases, but do it in such a way so that the strokes look like the person. And it's really, really beautiful work where you're layering the letters on top of each other so that if you're able to read the phrase, you're able to read it because you know the order that the letters are pronounced in. And the letters are used as their visual shapes. And I want to show you um, a really good example of Tura as a signature. And this is from one of the Ottoman uh, sultans or emperors. This is their signature. I mean, and this is not designed to look like a person. It's designed to be just a beautiful abstract visual by itself. And notice that this is on it. This is about maybe like that big or so. And the paint is this. I believe that this ink is indigo or lapis, which are both very incredibly expensive inks. This is actual gold leaf that is put in there. There's these teeny tiny little flowers throughout. You kind of see those with the little leaves, different kinds of flowers in each of the different sections. But this is a really good example of the Tura calligraphy, where the lettering is designed or is put together in such a way that it forms an image. It doesn't have to be a realistic image at all, and it usually is, and a lot of the times it's not, but it becomes its own thing. It's not just written from right to left to be read ordinarily. It just becomes a beautiful thing by itself. And I want to share. This is something else. I've taught classes on this as well. This is called Turkish marbling, or it's called Ebru, uh, and the some of these artists that work on it are just astounding. But again, because the Quran is forms such an integral part of the religious life of Muslims, and this is a Muslim empire, that's the worldview, then the book arts become incredibly important. And so this is um, I a friend of mine teaches Ebru classes in Salt Lake, and she looks like everybody's favorite aunt and mom. Just a very, very pleasant woman. Talk to her. You find out that she has her degrees in, um, I think it's hydroengineering, things like that. She really understands fluid dynamics. That's what her degrees are in, and she loves doing Ebru because uh, for her it's an exercise in the application of fluid dynamics, along with just a joyful expression of art, because you have to create a fluid base that's water with a little bit of a gelling agent in it. And then each of the inks have a slightly different dispersion rate when they hit the surface of the water. And you have to add the inks in specific orders, otherwise, they sink down to the bottom before you're done. And then you have these different combs to give different patterns to it. And let's see, I want to get to a video to show you about this. Again, we're not going to watch the whole video, but I want to. So this is how you start out with these inks. They're on the surface of this slightly gelled water, and then you comb in specific patterns. You can do different things like this by knowing how the ink spreads, how the inks interact with each other, the surface tension and stuff like that. I've seen people draw flowers and do portraits, just absolutely gorgeous stuff, just doing this. And basically, it's just very thin amounts of paint floating on the surface of the water. And then you take paper, you lay it in, or you very carefully lay it over the water, and then pull it off, and it transfers the ink right to the paper. So, some of these, their paintings are absolutely beautiful. And I have one of the gifts I was given is just a simple, I say simple, I can't do it. It's a simple painting of a tulip done by a master Ebru artist from Turkey that my friends with the Anatolia um, group in Salt Lake gave to me. And what's kind of fun is you'll see some of the artists, they'll very carefully apply thin, tiny amounts of paint in different ways to get it to do different things. And I've seen reproductions of Western paintings. Like this is Edvard Munch's The Scream done as Turkish Ebru. And I think a lot of this stuff is really amazing. Yes, absolutely. And this is all just ink floating on the surface of water. And one of the things that I've taught as well is vitre, which is Turkish style stained glass, a little bit different than Western stained glass. And if we look at these, you probably are familiar with some of the Western stained glass from some of the things we've already covered and looked at. Notice in this, we have floral images, and then we have these design elements. These are again verses from the Quran that are put in. The lettering in this case is white and yellow. The yellow is on a blue background, and the white is on a red background. And what's fascinating about this is that it's not put together the same way as Western art glass is. Not all the times. A lot of them can be, but the style is based on this idea of a framework that the glass sits in, and then you cast around it. And that's not how all the windows are made, but that's how the designs are generated. This idea of casting around the glass. And so that's why you have, in a Western style thing, these areas of blue would be a lot more solid. But in vitre, you have a lot of this visual texture going on in the background. I think it's really beautiful stuff. And I have some really good examples of it as well, but I thought that this picture was particularly beautiful. Oh, and let's see, I'm going to show you some lamps. This is very popular. It began with the Ottoman work, and this just kind of shows about how to make some of these lamps that they would make. But we'll get to the stained glass part. And these are all based on Roman style mosaics, where they start with a blown lamp base, and then they'll glue with a clear glue these glass pieces onto this blown glass base, put grout around it, just like you would a Roman mosaic. But when a light source is put inside, the mosaic comes out, and you can it just the imagery and the colors are cast onto the walls around it. And what's amazing to me is that some of this stuff, and you can see this is after they put the grout on it, and then when they clean it up, that's when you start seeing the colors. And the light on it, you can see it just casts all the colors all around it. So quite a bit different from traditional, like a Tiffany style lamp. What is really interesting to me too is that this has its roots early on the lamps in some of those um, mosques that we were looking at, that would be the only source of light. You know, for evening and morning prayers, when people would go into these buildings, they'd be really, really dark, but you'd have these lamps hanging from the ceiling. You know, these chains are sometimes hundreds of feet long where the lamps are. And what would be interesting is that they would take that glass. Let's see, we'll go like this glass area. That's what they would start on, but they would etch um, verses from the Quran into the glass, and then they would rub uh, black material like soot from a fire mixed with a bonding agent, so would stick to the etching of the glass, and so that the calligraphy from the Quran would be etched on the outside of the lamp, and then when they would hang it into the worship space and light it, those letters, just like we saw right here with the finished lamp casting the light, you can imagine the dark letters would be those shadows would be cast onto the walls around them. So the people, when they go into the worship space, would be surrounded and inside um, the verses from the Quran. I, really, a very, very cool idea. And this, I really like this website because it shows some of that vitré style as well, and you can see the little dots of color. That's where the design comes from. It is very different from it has that same kind of brilliance of color as Western stained glass does, but the designs are based on these smaller pieces of glass. And that's really very cool looking stuff. So so that's some of the stuff that I think is just absolutely astounding from uh, the Ottoman Empire. And again, this goes from about, I want to say, 1350 to maybe more contemporary to about 1600, 1700. This is what the time period that we're looking at. So a lot of medieval European crossover. So we're talking about through the Renaissance, tail end of the Renaissance, and a little bit more closely to contemporary times. We're talking about these people were trading with the Mughals in India. So they coexisted. There was a cross pollination of ideas, most likely. And then the descendants of the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire continued up until uh, end of the 1800s into the 1900s. So it continued for quite a while. It lasted for almost 600 years. And so from tail end of the Crusades, almost into the modern era, quite a long-lived uh, um, group of people, culture, uh, comparatively. And a lot of the stuff that I've shown you has been between about 1350 and 1650 in that age year range, but absolutely astounding. Now I'm going to see if I can find something that just blows me away. These are examples of the leaf calligraphy I was telling you about that the Ottoman rulers were really famous for. And they would take these leaves, punch out the areas in between veins, and leave the leaf structure in to keep that calligraphy. That's how they would generate the calligraphy. And this leaf is only like 3 inches tall, 3 inches long. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but really, really, really fascinating stuff. Some of these are going to be signatures. Most of them are going to be uh, verses from the Quran. Now, one thing I want to show you is that this shape right here that looks like a loopy W. And these kinds of things where you have a lot of long vertical strokes pointing into the center, this is most likely going to be a quote from the Quran because of the way that it's written. And whenever you see this, something like a W, And a lot of the times it will also have a vertical line in the middle. This is actually Arabic for the name of God in Islam, which is Allah. And that word Allah is the more contemporary pronunciation for the Aramaic word that Jesus used in his last prayer when he was calling to his Father while he was dying on the cross. And the word that he used is pronounced Eloi, and that's the Aramaic pronunciation of the Arabic word that came about a couple hundred years later of Allah. And both of them mean Lord of Lords or God of Gods. So, or God overall, rather. And essentially, that's what it means. An even older version of the same word is in Hebrew is uh, Elohim. Same kind of it's the same word just through the ages. Elohim, Eloi, and Allah is where that comes from. And again, that's where we see that right here. We see that right here. So just some really beautiful, beautiful images. And again, this is leaf calligraphy that the Ottoman rulers absolutely loved doing. And a lot of the most famous examples, the most beautiful examples are done by people that were ruling heads of state. You know, how I don't know how they had the time to do this kind of stuff because I have OCD and I can't imagine doing this. It's astonishing to me. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this week's module. And there's a lot of imagery to go through. Please watch as many of the videos as you possibly can, and then select something for your weekly reflection, one, two, or three things. And you can do traditional architecture. You can do leaf calligraphy if you want. Find one of the stained glass windows, whatever. One thing that I'm noticing is that when you do these weekly reflections, please look at the assignment description that I give. And I'm gonna go to that really quick here. Look at my example that I give, where I have, yeah, there is a little bit of an introduction right there. I have images, and then in the description, I do give a sentence of history, but the rest of this is describing what they actually look like. What am I seeing? What are the colors I'm seeing? What are the shapes? What's the imagery that I'm seeing? And sometimes people are in the description area, they're giving a history background that might fit better in the introduction or might fit better in the interpretation to give some background for the interpretation. Try to do your best to describe what you see. What is important is not what the history is, but I want you to express what you are encountering when you look at this. Describe it as precisely as you can, not writing an awful lot. I'm looking for maybe 4 or 5 sentences at the most, but describing your encounter with the object, not the history of it or what other people have to say about it. I don't care what other people have to say about it. I am interested in what you are seeing yourself. What you say is valuable, and this is an integral part of this process of making the weekly reflection. And notice that our all 4 tools are covered. The 4 tools are description, analysis, this is where you talk about how you think it might have been made, interpretation, what it could mean. This is where you bring in the history and say, well, I'm bringing in the history because I think it's related to this. Maybe you're applying semiotics to this. Maybe you're talking about the cultural mores of the time, what's important to the specific culture. And the evaluation is where you talk about how is it successful? Do you like it? You could talk about that in evaluation too. Or you could also say, I don't like it. I know it's important historically. I just don't like it. You know, and that's fine. The evaluation is where you talk about the value of it. whether it's successful, whether you think it has intrinsic value, whether it has actual physical market value, those kinds of ideas. And go to the page that says Tools of Artistic Critique. I do have a link up here. I believe I do. No, I may not. I'll put a link in then. But go to the page called Tools of Artistic Critique, and if you go to Modules, you go up here to Where to Start, and right here, third thing down, the 4 Tools of Artistic Critique. And this is where each one, description, analysis, interpretation, and evaluation, are each outlined. And there's questions that I want you to ask yourself while you're looking at the thing. And all you have to do is answer those questions to yourself and write about them. And I've had several people who are very successful at writing their weekly reflections, who they will open up a window, a tab on their computer where they have this. They'll have the picture next to them, and they'll just, under the description heading, they'll just write down the answers to these questions that they see. Under the analysis heading, they'll just respond to these questions. Interpretation, evaluation, same thing. And be mindful too of using these kinds of words. Be as precise as you can. I'm not looking for something that takes you a half an hour to write. I'm sorry. I am. You can spend a half an hour just looking at the thing and reflecting on it. I'm not looking for something that takes you a half a week to write. This only should take an hour or two. I'm not looking for something that is several pages long with extensive research. I'm not doing that. What I'm looking for is your articulation of your observations and your answers to these questions for each of the 4 tools. Because and that's one of the reasons why AI isn't going to help you, because these are your observations, not AI observations, but yours. And I value what you have to see, what you are seeing, and what you have to say about it. And if you have an evaluation on something where it's fewer points than you are hoping for, look at what I have to say. And if it doesn't make sense, contact me. We'll talk about it more, and I'll do my best to help explain. A couple of the students have turned in something several different times, and because I would explain something, they would come back, they would get that part of it, but something else wasn't quite right. So we'd talk about that. And several people have asked me to give them examples, so I've shared examples with them of really good ones by other students. And it looks to me like most everybody's doing a pretty good job. But if there are problems with less points, it's usually because you're not looking at what the actual questions are for that thing, or you're not expressing what you see yourself. Another thing might be that the picture of the object is missing. Another thing might be the citations are not in alphabetical order. They aren't correctly done. They don't have the accessed on phrase at the end. And it might be that sometimes people will get in a hurry and they'll combine different things. Like they won't have the description and analysis each under their own headings. They'll have the description and analysis together in one paragraph. You need to separate each thing out and do each of those 4 steps. And I know this is a pain in the neck, but after we do this a couple more times, you'll get into a hang of this, and you're going to start applying this to most of the things you encounter. And this is, I think, a really solid expression of critical thinking, where you can demonstrate to the people around you and to yourself how smart you really are, how observant you are, how well you can articulate what you see and what you encounter. And that's what I'm hoping for you. I want you to have that experience, to really be able to demonstrate the intellect that you've brought to the table by coming to the university and having that experience. If anybody has any questions about this or anything like that, let me know. I have noticed that it is taking a little bit of time to get from the recording and get it uploaded onto YouTube. So these should be published by tomorrow morning. and everybody should have access to them. Thank you very much for watching through this with me. And I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. And I look forward to visiting with everybody again next Tuesday. We'll see you.